Hey there, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Evoke Greatness. This podcast was created for those of you who, like me, are driven by their curious nature and fascination with the champion mindset. If you have an insatiable hunger for growth and knowledge, or maybe you're just curious on how some of the most successful people have navigated their journey, we share the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows, and all the lessons learned along the way. It doesn't matter what chapter you are on in your story. Maybe you're just getting started, or heck, maybe you're halfway through. What I know is where intention goes, energy flows. It's my most sincere hope that you will hear something in one or maybe many of these episodes that resonates with you and reminds you that you are not in this alone. As we venture into year 2, I hope that you find a sense of connection and community when you're here, because we all deserve a place where we belong. My name is Sunny, and I am so glad you're here. If you're new, there's a few things you want to know about me. I am a huge book nerd and a wee bit of a control enthusiast with an obsession for motivational coffee cups. I believe that a rising tide raises all ships, and I invite you along in this journey to evoke greatness. Welcome back to another episode of Evoke Greatness. I am excited for today's special episode that I'm coining Mindful Leadership. We are going to dive into the art and science of leadership and organizational excellence. So today we have the privilege of having two absolutely brilliant guests, Katie Desiderio and Michael Frino, authors of the groundbreaking book, The Beekeeper, Pollinating Your Organization for Transformative Growth. Katie and Michael both bring a unique blend of academic rigor and practical insight to the table, holding advanced degrees in the field of organizational learning and leadership. Together, they've turned their passion for performance optimization into a career specializing in creating transformative changes in organizational culture. In our conversation today, we're going to explore the innovative approaches to leadership, learn about the techniques they've honed to enhance team dynamics, and delve into their strategies for cultivating environments where both individuals and companies thrive. So Katie, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Sunny, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I am super excited. I have the book here. They were kind enough to send this to me. I'm a professed book nerd, but it's really a fun read. So anytime you have any sort of book that's written in a fable form, it really kind of draws you into it. And so you guys coined this a leadership fable, right? And so I would love for you to, number one, walk through where this idea kind of started to come to life. In doing some background, I think you two had went to school together, but this really kind of happened. The idea started to come to life when you two had met up in Chicago over some pizza and this now famous pizza box conversation. I would love for you to dive into that and really kind of talk through where that spurred and then how it kind of lit fire from there.
Yeah, I love that you're asking the question, Sunny. Mike and I actually laugh as we look back and say, we can't believe how this came to life. But to your point, Mike and I live thousands of miles apart, and we're both in Chicago for different reasons for business, about 30 minutes away from each other. And we said, let's get together. We haven't seen each other in a while. Let's connect over Chicago pizza and start to think about the imagination of this book that we want to write. And we literally, on the back of the pizza box, started mapping out pictures. And so you see pictures of bees and flowers and pollination, and kind of central to the theme when we think about leadership development and the work that Mike and I did in our doctoral program is foundationally based on growth. And so kind of just, internal passion for both of us is keeping learning and growth at the heart of everything we do for ourselves and for others. And so that's become just an innate driver in, where we show up and how we want to write and how we want to contribute to the field. And so Mike's a really creative thinker and said, what if we wrote a fable that was kind of guided by the lessons of bees? When we think about growth, right? Bees are put in the world to help the world around us grow. And so we started getting on this kind of imagination of what pollination would look like, and the leadership lessons. We kind of geeked out a little bit to seminal learnings that would tie to these. And then we left Chicago and came home, and 18 days later, it was UN World Bee Day. And so Mike sent me a text message and was like, I think it was meant to be, like, pun intended. I think there's something here. And so it really kind of just morphed into us like going with this vision and then working with Wiley to really bring it to life.
Yeah, and so you've kept this pizza box over the years, right? Just to really kind of memorialize this moment where your book really came to life.
Yep. We have the pizza box. And Mike, did I miss anything? Do you want to add anything?
Absolutely not. I mean, Katie was so nice. We saved the pizza box, and then we kind of made a copy of it, and we each have one, and it's super cool. It is a memorialized kind of version of it, and it's fun to look back at and see just what you wrote on that pizza box, and then how you brought that vision to life, and the iterations and the changes that occurred, but ultimately kind of what was the breaking moment, for lack of a better term. And, the emphasis is obviously the book. So it turned out it's cool to look back for sure.
For those who are kind of just maybe even haven't picked up a copy of the book yet, can you explain just the significance of the metaphor of that beekeeper in relation to organizational growth and development? How does that apply to that leader today?
It's interesting when we think about kind of this concept, and it's woven through the book, right, on being proximal. And proximal means center, closest to the heart. It's a medical term, but really, if you think about where bees pollinate, they go really to the center of the flower. We see that all the time. And it's like, oh my gosh, there's such a unique kind of analogy here. But when we think about organizational leadership, oftentimes we rely on people to help us achieve our career goals, develop our new skills, develop new competencies. And we have to not only look to different individuals to say, how can you model the way, and how can you teach me how to get better in this area? But how can then you place yourself in the center of someone else's growth? And it kind of becomes this concept of, if you're thinking about others and being more others focused, you really have an opportunity to help transform cultures. And that's what the beekeeper does, right? When we think about the beekeeper, there's thousands of bees in a hive, and they place themselves at the center of each hive's growth and making sure that it's thriving, and helping ensure that hive has what it needs to be successful and optimize performance of the hive. And we're not beekeepers, by the way. So, we had to do a ton of research. I want to preface this, like, Katie and I are academics. So we went out, we met with a lot of beekeepers and said, hey, we want to learn from you. And, it was so fun just to kind of throw the beekeeper suit on and just ask our questions like we would if we were doing an academic paper and doing our kind of research. So.
Yeah, that's exactly the direction I was going to go. Is you didn't just kind of step back and say, oh, I'm sure this is what this is like, right? You guys really went and you met with beekeepers and you really dove into what they know about their zone of genius around beekeeping, because there's really a ton to it. I mean, when you think about pollinators of the world, that is really what bees do. And so I love kind of those parallels that you drew throughout the book. For those who haven't, like I said, who haven't picked up the book yet, I'm someone who, when I read a book, the most enjoyable thing is when I can read it and the words on the page start to create like this movie in my head. And so I can almost see what's happening as I'm reading it. And so I really enjoyed reading the book because it really brought that picture to life in my mind. And so would you give a little bit of an overview, just so it can paint a picture for those who haven't read the story yet, to be able to draw them into that same picture?
Katie, why don't you take this one?
So Catherine, the protagonist in the story, runs this company called Essentially Proximal, and is kind of lost in like the day-to-day, challenges of running an organization. And seemingly, she goes on a vacation that her children propose that they go on, right? She has a different imagination of a vacation being very relaxing and something that's spa-like. And she ends up going, and I think all of us, the listeners could kind of imagine spaces where we do things that we're like, okay, fine, I'll do this, but I don't really want to. And so she goes into it very much the way we do in life, right? That like, okay, I'll do it. I'll check the box, not imagining that kind of this experience on the farm would really transform her and transform the way that she does work. And so the name of the book, The Beekeeper, Transforming Your Organization for Transformative Growth, is the space of how each individual can transform. And that starts with us, right? So in the tri-level of leadership, The beekeeper is about the individual level. It's about each person choosing who and how they want to be, and then the impact that can have, right, in organizations. And so as Catherine kind of progresses through this vacation on the farm, she meets someone who is a literal beekeeper, but turns into the metaphorical beekeeper, BE, because he becomes a mentor to her and sees things in her that she doesn't see in herself. He helps her with those lens check moments to look at things from a different angle, to take off the old lens of, oh, I don't want to be here, to, wow, I feel really inspired. And let me actually share this inspiration with my team. And so as she progresses, and this is truly in fable form, it's like happening fast, right? And faster than anything in real life could happen. But the transfer for us is to realize how transformation happens. It's sometimes in really unsuspecting ways. We need to find people, growth partners. Mike and I are growth partners. Catherine finds a growth partner in the story who ends up helping her to start to think about unlearning ways that she had done things previously and replacing that with new ways of thinking and being. And so this is where we make that draw and the parallels to Beekeeper as BE, and each chapter name is a bee mindset. And so, Sunny, I know on your podcast, you talk a lot about mindset. And this becomes critical, right, as we're thinking about how we're championing the things that we want, like where we put intention encourages growth. And so in many ways, there's parallels to that space of what we give our time and energy to grows.
The lesson is with learner's mind, sometimes we go in and don't really think that this is going to be a learning opportunity, but just being curious, which is obviously one of the chapter titles, is really essential to learning and growth at the individual level.
And one of the things that I appreciated about it is it really piqued in her this sense of curiosity, the sense of being willing to lean into a bit of a wonderment. And I think that then opened up exploring the way that she was thinking previous versus all of a sudden starting to have these really engaging conversations with the beekeeper where she was almost hoping to run into him more often, hoping to engage and have more conversation, which really drew you in as the different principles came about.
And Sunny, you bring up something really important, in the spirit of be curious, this bee mindset. There's an undertone of how we encourage the opportunity to be active consumers in our life, right? So often we become passive consumers. We just do what we do and we get in our routines and we let things happen. And, we fail to kind of have agency over how we author our leadership story. And so very much we see Catherine go through her story starting to reclaim, right, that curiosity and that sense of learning and what happens when you do that, right, that it fulfills you in a way that encourages behavior change, but then becomes infectious for the people that you're working with and through. And I think that's where real growth happens.
Yeah. And I think, you talked about the name of her company. And as we talk about proximity and we think about proximity in our everyday, whether it be in workplace, in our teams. And, I'm curious for both of you, what are your thoughts around kind of cultural or even industry specific differences and how proximity influences organizational dynamics?
Yes, such a good question. I think, when you're thinking about leaders, and Katie mentioned the tri-level of leadership earlier, right? I think we all have an opportunity at the tri-level, right? The individual, group, and organization to lead from the seat we're in. It's something that I know in a lot of industries that we espouse to be very important, right? We want to see leaders enact that at the individual level, you have to be a leader from the seat you're in, right? You have to place yourself at the center of other people's growth, organizational growth. Sometimes the mistake we make is that we wait for this hierarchical approach of, oh, well, I can't get direction or I can't do this because my leader is not involved or my manager's not involved or I don't have buy-in. But, really what happens is that it's all about empowerment, and it's all about leaders empowering people in the organization to bring their best authentic selves to work and use the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they have to execute whatever vision the company has or strategic plan the company has. And, if we can create that culture where people feel comfortable doing that, I think transformation happens. But that only happens if organizations create that right environment, just like the beekeeper does for the bees, right? Where people can do their job. If you think that, if you can imagine a beehive, right, all the bees buzzing around doing their own individual jobs, right, they all have the same vision, right? They all want to have a thriving hive. They all are producing to pollinate the world around them. And we want that metaphor to live in organizations each and every day, because everybody plays such an important role no matter who you are.
Yeah, I want to add something. Sunny, you had me thinking, and in such a good question about proximity, that we often hear now post-pandemic, a lot of companies are failing in using terms like return to work. So there's an assumption made there that people weren't working when they were not visibly seen or in the physical space, which is wrong, right? And that's demotivating and deflating. And so there's lots of ways in the space of proximity. Mike and I live thousands of miles away from each other, see each other a couple times a year, but really, right, in proximity, come together on shared vision and the way that we connect and when we connect and how we ensure that there's high returns. And so for organizations, as we're building culture, to Mike's point, we have to be mindful of that space of proximity, that we are connecting with the humans. And you don't always have to be in a physical space to do that. But when you are, how are you ensuring that there's high returns, right? How are you ensuring that that connection is different in ways that become lasting? And so I think there's ways for us to think about, proximity in the literal sense as well.
It's a perfect segue into what I was going to ask next, which is how can leaders foster that sense of closeness and connection among their team members, regardless of whether they're in the office together or they're thousands of miles apart, regardless of their actual physical closeness?
Yeah, I think, there's so many ways in my head that's bouncing around, but I think one of the ways that leaders can foster this and organizations can foster this is to really, really turn the mirror and understand what people need and how they show up each and every day. And I think it's a lot of reflection on what does this individual need, what motivates them, what gets them fueled. And if we can understand that, not only about the people we work with and through, but about ourselves, it becomes so important to make sure that the connection is real. Otherwise it becomes so surface level and it's just an interaction versus truly understanding what fuels Katie and how can I make sure that, when we interact, that's an important element of our connection. And that should apply to organizations as well and everybody that you meet with, and vice versa. There's reciprocity there. Katie and I, we use DISC personality assessments a lot. And, for example, we couldn't be further away on the DISC map. And we talk about this a lot because even though we're very different, we have an understanding of how we show up, but how the other person shows up. And we work to stretch to ensure that those interactions are positive, meaningful, and really, fueling each other.
Yeah, Katie, when you mentioned through COVID and this return to work, so many things happened, I think, psychologically, emotionally through COVID. I did a lot of speaking kind of throughout that period of time. And it was really on that idea of retention and how do we keep our team together in a time when we probably have never felt farther apart. And the three things that I talked about were community, connection, and communication, because those were some of the three things that were really lacking in that period of time. So people who may have been in the office together were no longer able to be in the office together. And what I found from a turnover perspective was it became very easy for someone to email in a resignation when they don't have a sense of connection and community with their team or with their leader. And so the conversations and speaking that I did was really around how do we do some of those things that you talked about, Michael, which is how do we figure out what's really important to our people, regardless of our proximity of physical proximity, right? How do we identify what's important to them? How do we know what makes them feel connected and a part of the team, regardless of where we are? And so I think those things, as we started to kind of come out of that COVID phase of really feeling like there was this weird distance between everyone, that sense of community started to return. And I think that was actually what made the work from home as successful as it's been, is people who are really intentional around how they bring people together, right? We can all jump on a Zoom call, but if the Zoom call is meaningless and lacks intentionality, it's not going to do anything. It's, same as another meeting in the office. But when we really bring something to that with intentionality and a sense of connection and community, it elevates that experience for everyone involved.
You're so right, Sunny. And I love those 3 C's that you mentioned. Connection and communication are 2 of my core values. And so I have lots of ideas, right, of why that's so important. But I realize that's subjective. But it also comes into the answer to your question is, how do we create this? And it's about asking, back to Mike's point, you know, Mike's disc style is a DC style. I'm an SI style. We have connection and I have line shading in D, but we look at those differences of our needs, they're really different. And so we have to communicate. We have to be able to talk about and acknowledge those differences, not right or wrong, right? But acknowledging like where we're fueled, what we look for, where we prioritize energy, what our natural mindsets are. And that creates that sense of connection, right? So as us asking the questions, leaning into the human element, right? But then looking back to your point, we're creating a sense of community when we're doing these charters as a whole, as a group. What do we care about, right? These are your individual values, but what are our shared values? What are the things that fuel us together? How do we come together with intention to make sure that there's high returns, right, on that time investment? And I think that's too, it's like that unlearning. Let's just not have the same meetings because it's the way that we've always done it. Let's unlearn those and replace them with different habits that have those higher returns of connection.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk a lot about the importance of nurturing a culture of diversity and inclusion. Can you talk a little bit about how this contributes to any organization's success?
Yeah. So Mike and I do a lot of work in the space of, inclusive leadership. And I don't want to make a blanket statement, but oftentimes deep level diversity attributes, those we just mentioned, are missed, right? So when we think about inclusive leadership, we have to bring in surface level diversity differences. We have to bring in deep level diversity. And when we're creating an environment that's really inclusive, we're rounding out the circle to ensure that surface level diversity is front and center, but that we're also creating an environment where diversity of thought and voice and experiences are also welcome. And so this is really where DISC could play a role, because we realize as we're building high performing teams, we can make assumptions that, let's say, in a sales role, well, really only a D or an I style would be successful in sales. We're self-limiting, right? If we're putting emphasis on only those styles, right? Outgoing, energizing, driven, right? We could bring in really analytical people and that could do masterful work, right? In the sales space, if we're creating an environment that welcomes, right, those deep level diversity differences. And so in many ways, it's about taking that step back and some of the unconscious bias that we have, right? And really creating an environment to learn with and through one another, to enact growth mindset, to say like, interesting, like I was really successful in this work as this style, right? Bringing these, attributes, but wow, right? You do it different. We get to the same goal in different ways. And we start to see magic happen when we allow that authenticity and the encouragement for people to bring their gifts and talents, right, to get to shared goals in different ways.
Actually, being a Wiley Disc partner myself, as I had shifted out of the C-suite and focused on consulting and executive coaching, that has been something, it was one of the first things that I did, was I really wanted to be able to take that with me as I was coaching different leaders in the C-suite. Mm-hmm. And what I have found is, initially, I go in, if I'm working with an organization or an individual leader, I do the DISC assessment. I really want to know. Oftentimes you'll hear, oh, no, well, I've done this or I've done that. I'm like, let's do a really up-to-date one, though, because it really does change. I found that personally. And so we'll do it and we sit down, especially as a team. And I have never walked out of a DISC review meeting where someone wasn't like, wow, when you really think about how deep it goes in, just the differences that each person brings to the table, the ways to navigate conflict. And I think those are the steps that oftentimes leadership teams either miss or don't have the intentionality around truly going deep on. But I think when you have a really, really strong team, you have to know each other's strengths and weaknesses. You have to know how each other navigates heated moments, celebratory moments, things like that. And so
Mhm.
I have found that that is such an incredible tool for, number one, people to get to know each other, but also it's very introspective in how they get to know themselves as well.
So important.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's so important. And I love that we have this shout out to Wiley here on, on this podcast right now.
Right. Well, when you think about the characteristics that it comes down to for a leader, someone who is really bringing the elements that we've talked about, someone who can show up and lead a team with a sense of depth, with a sense of intentionality, who really wants to create that sense of community. What are those characteristics or those leadership traits that someone should think about when they say, gosh, I want to take myself and my leadership from maybe the 1.0 version to the 2.0 version? How could someone actively, or what should someone actively focus on to really elevate their leadership for themselves and their team?
I love the fact you even asked that. I hope all leaders are asking themselves that. Personally, I think times leaders don't say, how can I take myself to the next level? But, for leaders who do, I think oftentimes it's that introspection, right? It's turning the mirror inward, but also kind of understanding how your team, what they need to really be, to be fueled. We mentioned it earlier. I think building high performing teams comes down to like hiring the right people first, right? I think hiring and talent acquisition becomes a critical skill for any manager who wants to take, their organization to the next level. We oftentimes hire people that, you talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, that kind of like you see yourselves in them almost. And that's not always the best way to say, I want to hire this person, right? Even though they may be able to do the job, you have to kind of think differently. And so talent acquisition, developing, competencies and skills of your team are really important. And being others focused. We mentioned this, but my style is naturally DC style. And I'm always focused on like performance. I want to get to the next thing. I want to do the next thing. I want to, perform at a high level, which is great, but not everybody needs that. So I want to hire people who are empowered to do things different and can help me see things differently. And that's really, I would say, one of the critical skills. And I'm sure Katie can touch on some more that really, I think managers can elevate their game is by hiring the right people around them and empowering them to do their best work and getting out of their way, really, frankly, and letting them do their job.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned, the kind of growth of leaders. And that's really, I think, the beauty of this art of learning to be proximal is effective leaders are always learning and growing. We're always authoring, right? New chapters and new versions. Like we're trying to be better tomorrow. And so in that space, there's like a freeing space. And I do a lot of work in the space of, kind of flipping imposter syndrome to confident humility is that, how are we showing up curious, learning, growing, right? Evolving in our thinking, adopting new habits that help us to serve our teams and to help us get out of our own way. I think seemingly a lot of times it's just easy for us to get in our own way, right? In our own thinking or in our own habits or the way we think it should be. And when we're showing up curious, we're kind of really doing that self-check to say, let me just, to Mike's point, every day, let me just be better. How can I do this better tomorrow? And that continues to evolve over time.
When you talked about talent acquisition, it brought me back. I got a little flashback of when I first became a leader. Green had no idea, oftentimes in the same position as others, where you don't really get put into a leadership position. Maybe you don't get all the training. Maybe you don't get the how-to guide on how to be a leader. And so when I started hiring people, I leaned towards hiring people just like myself.
Mhm.
And I thought I was making great hires. And it wasn't until a leader above me brought to my attention and he said, wow, Sunny, these people that you're hiring, they're a lot like you. And I said, I know. And it was like this sense of ridiculous, pride that I had. And he said, so tell me, on those areas where you're not covering the basis, how are they? And I was like, oh my goodness. And it wasn't until someone really had that pretty transparent feedback with me of, if you're hiring someone with your similar qualities and your similar strengths, who's covering the areas where there are weaknesses or those completely open, uncovered spots? And I have found that a number of leaders face that. It's we do what we think is the right thing to do. And when we're familiar with ourselves, we hire similar to that. And so I love that you mentioned that about really the diversity among hiring is not just surface level, but sometimes it's really looking at, as an organization, as a team, where do we not have our bases covered, right? Where do we have some weaknesses or some areas that need to be strengthened? And how do I hire accordingly to ensure the success of the team and organization could be in this next hire of making sure that we fill those areas with really great talent?
So well said.
Oftentimes, with collaboration, it's the key to driving innovation. How do you guys think that leaders encourage that cross-functional collaboration within their organization? Almost that pollination within the organization.
We saw this, a glimpse of this in the leadership guide to creating a thriving hive at the end of the book is, we kind of wove in some of those undertones. And Sunny, you probably pulled them out, but each of those different employees of essentially Proximal had different disc styles, right? And so we kind of pulled on the thread of the deep level diversity differences in how they were interpreting, right, some of the messages that were coming from Catherine in those emails that she was sending. And so this opens up two things. When we're breaking down silos, we have to be mindful that we're looking at and learning and listening from each other, right? We're each interpreting things different. We're looking at the imagination of how these things make sense within our own teams. But then it's coming back to that kind of common thread. And so I think there's a space of, effectively being able to communicate our overarching direction and the ability for us to get there together, right? And that learning happens when we're breaking down those silos and we're looking over to those other functions to ensure that the whole system is working together and not in each, individual isolated spaces. And so, a lot of that takes the openness to just be able to have those conversations, to even learn about what some of those other functions are doing and to invite it into the conversation. So, Mike, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, certainly all of those things, Katie, that you said, and just kind of going back to one of the comments that you mentioned on some of leadership skills that are really important. I think leaders need to model collaboration, right? If your leadership team is not modeling what it means to be a good collaborator, often the people in the organization on your team don't really know how to do it, right?
Yeah.
They don't see you modeling the behavior. So that's part of kind of being an exemplary leader, right? Is modeling the right behaviors. But also, I do think that people they still have a sense of, I want to do this. I want to get this across the finish line. This is how I'm going to get rewarded and recognized by doing this. But what we're seeing more and more in organizations is that those who bring people along with them and build a really strong support team and collaborate effectively are often the ones who get to the finish line faster, right? Because we can't be subject matter experts in everything. Organizations are getting bigger and employing more resources. And so how do we effectively tap into those talents, right? So we can, optimize performance. And sometimes people don't think like that. They're like, no, I can figure this out, which is a good mindset. But in organizational culture today, I really think we need to take a step back and say, okay, it's not just about me. It's about the organization. As Katie mentioned, how can we kind of achieve what we're trying to do from a strategic standpoint, and what resources are available to me to make this happen faster, better, and help the company, achieve what they're trying to accomplish. So I think that's kind of one of the things I would add, and a really great skill for leaders to kind of think about.
Yeah, and I draw the parallels. I had shared with you guys before we started hitting record that my husband has a number of businesses, one of which is pest control. And so we have a garden out in our backyard, and it brings in all kinds of beautiful things of nature. We have all these blooms happening, and so bees come in and they're pollinating everywhere. We have hummingbirds coming in, and it was just really fascinating. But within the last couple of months, he was actually sharing with me how bees go from blossom to blossom and actually so I had no idea really like the concept of bees. I just know that they pollinate. I know that, they do this all over. And really what he was sharing with me is he said, well, do you know how they actually collect the pollen as they go along? I'm like, what? I'm a nerd for things like this. And he said, yeah, they actually have, depending on what type of bee it is, like they actually gather these pockets of pollen, I believe like on their hind legs, and carry them with them. And they actually take that back to the hive. And as I was thinking about this and reading the book and all of this really like magically coming together, I was thinking about how so often as a leader within an organization, we're going around and we're collecting a lot of things, right? We're collecting experiences. We're collecting lessons. Lessons typically don't come from successes, right? Lessons typically come from the missteps and failures, if you will. And those actually provide us these beautiful lessons. And so we're going around like almost collecting all this pollen or putting all of this in our leadership tool belt. And I think someone can really picture this book and picture how a leader can pollinate the different people and the different departments in their organization. Like that just came to life in my mind is like, okay, let's scoop up all of this that we can, these lessons, this wisdom, discernment, experience, and really share that. And I think we do that through collaboration. We do that through sharing vulnerably, with our teams and with others within our organization. But I wanted to share how well it just brought this picture to life in my mind.
I love this so much, Funny. Like I could have just listened to you talk about this forever. And you were making me think about the be mindset of be present. And so in order for us to kind of pick up all those little learnings, like we really do have to be present. It goes back to what we talked about earlier is how are we curious? How are we active consumers in our life to say, what can I learn from every single person that I'm interacting with, right? From the different people around my organization. How are we picking up these little pockets of learnings just to be better, right? To help us grow and then to be able to help others grow. But we don't do that if we're head down, task focused, right, on autopilot. And I think that key is coming off autopilot to be present and connect.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we live in a super fast-paced world. Speaking of being present, we can't escape the fact that there are things that are happening very quickly inside of organizations. There's acquisitions. There's just rapid growth. All of these goals that we have, right? We're often kind of ticking the box. And so as you think about kind of the fast pace that sometimes we have to live in, how do you both see the role of leadership evolving in that rapidly changing business landscape, particularly in the context of fostering that transformative growth?
Yes, you hit on it earlier. And, it comes down to that space, Sunny, of how are we encouraging, leadership is really about influence. It's not about position or power. And so as Mike mentioned earlier, how are we encouraging ourselves and the people around us to lead from any seat? We have to start to look at leadership in that space, right? So there's lots of people who hold titles that seemingly people think should be leaders, but aren't, right? Leadership is earned and people don't have to follow you. And so when we start to look at this opportunity, the future of leadership is really looking at the ability to encourage, leading from every seat. And so, Mike and I are both parents. We talk a lot about the opportunities of leadership development and learnings for us in our field at home, right? How are we modeling leadership opportunities for our kids who are our future leaders? And so in that space of just voice and being present, and the one that keeps coming up that you elicited is just to be curious, right? Ask a lot of questions, keep learning, put yourself out there in the space of saying, I don't understand, or I've never heard that before, or it's so interesting because I always thought about it this way. Tell me more. And then we're opening up our minds really to look at, creating leaders around us without inhibiting it tied to a certain title or role.
Yeah, and just building on that, so well said. And I think there's so many lessons that apply, at home and at work. But we've touched on it and made some threads all throughout our kind of discussion. But especially when organizations are buying companies or there's M&A going on, right, and there's acquisitions, a lot of times the individuals in the organization are blind to what's going on behind the scenes, right, and don't really know that stuff is occurring until it really is announced, right, or happens, or there may be rumbling. So it's really important, I think, for leaders, and Simon Sinek's work kind of talks about this, about understanding the why. Why did we do this, right? If leaders can get really good at articulating the why behind something, why we did this, why we acquired this organization, why we acquired this company, and the impact to you at the individual and team level, like I think that's where leaders will thrive. If the leader doesn't know the why behind it and can't clearly articulate it, like trust gets impacted really quickly, right? Organizational trust gets impacted, and what the individuals in the organization say, oh my gosh, how is this going to impact my job? How is this going to impact my team? And when that starts happening, culture becomes impacted, right? So understanding the why behind something, ensuring your leadership team knows how to communicate that why effectively with a balance of empathy, but also strategy is a skill that I think is very hard to develop in leaders, but something that all organizations should be trying to figure out.
Mike, as I was listening to you, you're coming back to Sunny's 3 C's. I mean, really, it's in communication, connection, and creating community, right? Is that
Yep.
that grounded culture? So, Sunny, you're onto something big there.
Well, and I love how when you talk about that kind of curious mindset or really showing up curious as a leader, oftentimes people want to have the answer. They want to have the right answer, or they may lead off with the direction. And I think if we step back as leaders and we model curiosity, or we model maybe not being the first one to answer, or we model not having to have the right answer, right? And modeling, hey, let's dig a little deeper. I'm not sure I fully understand this. So, I think leading both vulnerably and modeling that curiosity, that does something to a team where I hate to say giving permission, but that's, at the end of the day, that's kind of what it does. It allows others to not have to have the right answer or not feel like, okay, this answer has to fall within this. It allows them to lean into that space of, hey, let's get creative and curious here.
Yeah, you're right. And when you think about inviting behavior modeling, the things that we want to see, it goes back to, I hear so many leaders who suffer from imposter syndrome. I should know. I should have the answers. Right? People aren't going to think that I'm, credible or successful, or I won't be ethos building if. That's wrong. And in your suggestion, when we lean into that space of instead confident humility, like, wow, that was such a great question, or I've never really thought about that answer, right? Let's find out together. Or we're doing what you mentioned earlier too, is like you have people who have different mindsets than we do that are thinking about these things in different ways that can actually answer the question better than us. And so how do we create the platform for all voices to be heard? It doesn't always have to be the person who's considered the leader, right? Because the leader's creating an environment for everyone to rise. And so that becomes a critical space of knowing when to take a step back, knowing when to be quiet, knowing when to elevate those other voices.
By the time this comes out, this will be right on the tail of your guys' 1-year anniversary of this incredible book and the amazing success that you've had over the last year. So number one, congratulations to you both, because I think you brought something really tremendous that's a breath of fresh air in a space where sometimes it can get stagnant. Oftentimes we kind of hear the same thing churned over and over. And I personally, and I'm a big personal development and professional development person, it was really refreshing for me to read this and really enjoy it as much as I did. And so unfortunately, I'm catching it on that, kind of tail end of a year. So I would really encourage people to go get that. But I really want to congratulate you guys on bringing something in such a different perspective for people to take and put in their tool belt to be able to transform their leadership.
Thank you, Sunny. It's been such a fun journey. I think Katie and I are very humbled by the entire thing, and just the whole year. And we are excited for our 1-year anniversary for sure. And, we can't wait to kind of see what continues to happen with the Beekeeper.
Yeah. And you have some exciting news as you have really kind of a number 2 book in the works. Would love for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah. So first of all, this is an opportunity for us to really thank Wiley. They've been incredible partners as our publisher, being first-time authors in this space. We leaned in really curious. And so I don't know if Wiley was ready for us because we were just full of questions, full of exploration. We wanted to meet with everyone, talk to everyone, and we're still in a space of learning. And so we're authoring the final pages of book number 2 that kind of builds on really the Beekeeper. We mentioned a couple times today the tri-level of leadership. And so the Beekeeper really focused on that individual level. The second book, and I won't say the title yet because Wiley, it might massage the title a little bit, but it is a fable number 2. It's going to the group or team level. So we look at individual, group, and organization. This is the group or team level. Another leadership fable. Mike and I have had a great time doing the field research that's really informing book number 2. And this will come out early 2025.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on that. As someone who I would bring all of my team in for quarterly strategic meetings. And I was a big believer in kind of the latest book that I felt was most impactful or could be most impactful to my leaders or organization. I would bring copies of the book in for everyone. So I encourage people to do that as you think about that. Really pick up a copy of the Beekeeper for yourself first. And then I strongly suggest that you bring that in at a team level for the individual leaders. Because I think part of this book, there's an introspective piece to it, which then lends itself to kind of lead, how can I show up differently for others?
Yes, Sunny, thank you for that recommendation for listeners to go get the book. If listeners do pick up the book, they can become a member of the Hive on leadershipfables.com. And as a member of the Hive, we have resources on there where Mike and I have created growth guides that you can use for team reads, for book club reads, for individual purposes. And so we kind of tried to think about the different ways that readers might use the book and created those guides to help kind of orchestrate that process.
Excellent. Well, Katie, Mike, thank you so much. Number one, for the work that you did just in getting to this place, the creativity that you leaned into, the research that you leaned into, pulling the academic side into that real personal side as well, so that you created something that really can serve leaders in their organization. So thank you for your work. And thank you guys for your time and being on today.
Thank you for having us. This has been so fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening and for being here on this journey with me. I hope you'll stick around. If you liked this episode, it would mean the world for me if you would rate and review the podcast or share it with someone you know may need to hear this message. I love to hear from you all and want you to know that you can leave me a voicemail directly. If you go to my website, evokegreatness.com, and go to the Contact Me tab, you'll just hit the big old orange button and record your message. I love the feedback and comments that I've been getting, so please keep them coming. I'll leave you with the wise words of author Robin Sharma. Greatness comes by doing a few small and smart things each and every day. It comes from taking little steps consistently. It comes from making a few small chips against everything in your professional and personal life that is ordinary, so that a day eventually arrives when all that's left is the extraordinary.